In 1957, an amateur archaeologist named Guy Melgren was digging at a site in Maine. The place was an old Native American settlement, the Goddard site near Naskag Point. It had been a busy coastal hub for centuries. People had lived and traded there long before Columbus. Melgren found arrowheads, pottery shards, and tools. Then he found something else. It was a small, thin silver coin. It looked old. It did not look like any American or European coin he knew. He didn't think much of it at first. It was just one of thousands of artifacts pulled from the site over the years. The coin sat in a collection, mostly unexamined, for 2 decades. In the late 1970s, experts finally took a serious look at it. One specialist from London identified it. The coin was a Norse penny. It was minted in Norway during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre, sometime between 1067 and 1093. This was a shock. How did an 11th century Viking coin get to a Native American camp in Maine? The coin itself was not proof of a Viking settlement in Maine. It was too small, too singular, but it was proof of something just as big. It was proof of a network. The coin was likely minted in Scandinavia, traveled to the Norse settlements in Greenland, and was then traded south. Perhaps a Norse trader brought it down the coast. Or perhaps it was traded from one native group to another, passing hand to hand over hundreds of miles, its original meaning lost. Either way, it connected 2 worlds. It showed that the maps we learn in school are too simple. The lines between continents were not empty. People were crossing them. Vikings were in America, not just for a brief moment in Newfoundland, but long enough for their money to become part of the local economy, a single silver penny that rewrites a piece of history we thought we knew. It was a ghost from a forgotten trade route, a hint of a much wider, messier, and more interesting past. Number 22. They came for walrus ivory, not for land. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson, and he was lost. The year was 986. He wasn't an explorer. He was a merchant captain trying to get from Iceland to the new colony in Greenland his father had just joined. But a storm blew him off course. For days, he sailed through thick fog and harsh winds, the sun just a pale smear in the sky. When the weather finally cleared, he saw land. It was not the mountainous, ice-capped coast of Greenland he expected. This land was low and covered in trees. Bjarni knew this was not his destination. His crew wanted to go ashore, to see what was there, to get fresh water. Bjarni refused. He was a practical man. His goal was to reach his father, not to wander around an unknown wilderness. He turned the ship north and sailed along the coast for days. He saw another stretch of flat, forested land. Still not Greenland. He kept going. He saw a third land, this one with mountains and glaciers. It looked more promising, but he didn't stop. Finally, after more sailing, he found the familiar shores of Greenland and the settlement of his father, Herjolf. He told people his story. He spoke of the wooded lands to the west. Nobody was very interested at first. They were busy trying to survive in Greenland. They were farmers, and this new home was hard. The land was marginal. They needed resources. A decade or so later, Leif, the son of Eric the Red, remembered Bjarni's story. Leif was different. He was curious. He bought Bjarni's ship and set out to find those lands. He found the glacial land Bjarni had seen last. He called it Helluland, the land of flat stones. Today we call it Baffin Island. He found the forested land. He called it Markland, the land of forests. That was likely Labrador. Then he found a third land, a place with grapevines and good timber. He called it Vinland. For years, people thought Vinland was a myth, a tall tale from the sagas. Then, in 1960, archaeologists Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad found the remains of a Norse settlement at a place called Lance Eos Meadows in northern Newfoundland, Canada. They found the foundations of 8 turf-walled buildings. They were identical to houses in Greenland and Iceland from the same period. They found a smithy with a furnace and scraps of iron. They found a spindle whorl, a small stone flywheel for spinning wool. This meant women were there. This wasn't just a sailor's camp. It was a small settlement, a base of operations. Maybe 70 to 90 people lived there. But they didn't stay. The settlement was probably used for less than 20 years, maybe only a few seasons. Why? The sagas talk about conflict with the native people, the Skraelings. Archaeology supports this. An arrowhead of a native type was found at the site, but it was more than that. The real purpose of the Vinland voyages was not colonization. It was resources. The Greenland colony was poor in two crucial things, wood and iron. Greenland had almost no trees tall enough for building ships or houses. The Lanceo Meadows was perfectly placed as a base camp to harvest timber from the forests of Markland further south. They also came for luxury goods. They found butternuts at the site, a type of walnut that doesn't grow in Newfoundland. They must have been gathered on expeditions further south, deep into what is now New Brunswick or even New England. The main prize, though, might have been something else: walrus ivory. In the 11th century, walrus ivory was a precious commodity in Europe. It was used for making crucifixes, chess pieces, and luxury items. The Greenlanders controlled the main source of this ivory from the walrus herds in the north. The Vinland settlement could have been a gateway to new hunting grounds or a trading post to acquire pelts and other goods. It was an economic venture. When it stopped being profitable, or when the danger from the native population became too great, they simply packed up and left. They had what they needed. It was a business trip, not an invasion. The settlement at Lansos Meadows was forgotten by everyone except the saga writers, a small, lonely outpost that was, for a brief time, the westernmost edge of the European world. Number 21. The last message was a carved stone in a frozen wasteland. The Uinartok artifact is not much to look at. It's a small, flat stone about the length of a finger, found in a fjord in Greenland in the 1930s. It's covered in runes. For a long time, its meaning was a mystery. The runes were cryptic, a mix of standard letters and secret symbols. Recently, scholars deciphered it. The stone, carved in the late 13th or early 14th century, seems to say something like Erling Sigvatsson and Bjarni Thordarson and Enright Oddsson raised this mound on the Saturday before Rogation Day. You know, it sounds simple, just three men marking a spot, but the date is important. Rogation Day is a Christian holiday in late spring. These men were marking time with the church calendar, even out here in the wilderness, and they were building a cairn, a mound of stones. This wasn't just graffiti, it was a formal act. These three men, whose names we now know, were part of the western settlement of Greenland. It was the smaller and more northerly of the two Norse colonies. At its peak, around 90 farms were scattered across the fjords near modern-day Nuuk. They were farmers, but they were also hunters. The western settlement depended on the annual Norgeseder hunt. Every summer, the strongest men would sail hundreds of miles north to a place called the Northern Hunting Grounds near Disco Bay. There, they hunted walrus for ivory and tusks, seals for meat and skins, and polar bears for pelts. This trade was the economic lifeblood of the entire Greenland colony. It was how they paid their tithes to the church in Norway. It was how they bought iron, grain, and anything else they couldn't produce themselves. Erling, Bjarni, and Enride were likely on one of these hunts. They built their marker, then what? They would have returned home to their farms. The western settlement was always living on the edge. The climate was colder and the land less fertile than in the larger eastern settlement to the south. Their entire existence was a careful balance. They farmed sheep and goats, but much of their diet, up to 80%, came from the sea. They ate seals, lots of seals. Archaeologists have excavated their garbage heaps, their middens. The bones tell the story, and seal bones are everywhere. They relied on that annual hunt not just for trade, but for survival. Then, sometime around the year 1350, the western settlement vanished. We don't know exactly what happened. A man named Ivar Bardarson, a Norwegian cleric sent to Greenland, visited the area around 1355. He found it completely abandoned. He wrote that he found no people, neither Christian nor heathen, only some wild cattle and sheep. The farms were empty. The church stood silent. The people were just gone. What happened to them? It wasn't a sudden disaster. There are no signs of a massacre or a plague. The most likely answer is a slow, grinding decline. The climate got colder. This was the beginning of the Little Ice Age. The winters grew longer, the summers shorter. Growing hay for their livestock became harder and harder. The sea ice choked the fjords for more of the year, making sailing and hunting more difficult. The walrus herds might have moved further north, making the vital hunt more dangerous and less reliable. The market for walrus ivory in Europe also collapsed as cheaper elephant ivory began coming in from Africa. Their economic lifeline was cut. Faced with starvation, the people of the Western settlement probably just left. They didn't have the resources to sail back to Iceland or Norway. Their ships were likely in poor repair after decades of isolation. Their best option might have been to move south and join the Eastern settlement, or perhaps they tried to move west, chasing rumors of Vinland. Some have even suggested they assimilated with the local Inuit people, who were better adapted to the changing climate. We don't know for sure. There was no final battle, no dramatic end. Just a slow, quiet fading away. The farms were left to the wild sheep, and the people walked away from their homes and were never heard from again. The Uinardoc stone, with its 3 names, is one of the last messages we have from them, a small, personal mark left on a vast, empty landscape. Number 20, they controlled a river of silver and furs. In the year 862, according to the old chronicles, a Varangian chieftain named Rurik arrived at a settlement on the Volkhov River. He came at the invitation of the local Slavic and Finnic tribes. They had been fighting among themselves and couldn't establish order. The chronicle says they sent a message to the Scandinavian newcomers. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. Rurik came. He established his base at a place called Ladoga, or Aldejuborg in Old Norse. This small settlement became the first capital of what would eventually become the nation of Russia. Staraya Ladoga, as it's called today, is about 120 kilometers east of St. Petersburg. It's a quiet village now. But in the 9th century, it was a boom town. It was the gateway to a vast network of rivers that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. It was the start of the trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks. For a Norseman, this was the path to incredible wealth. The forests to the east were filled with animals: sable, marten, squirrel, fox. Their pelts were worth a fortune in the markets of Europe and the Middle East. The rivers also led south to the great cities of Constantinople and Baghdad. Archaeologists digging at Ladoga have uncovered this story. They found the remains of Scandinavian-style log buildings. They found blacksmith shops and workshops for carving bone and antler. They found artifacts from all over the known world. There were beads from India, glass from Syria, and shells from the Red Sea. And there was silver, huge amounts of silver. They found caches of Arabic dirhams, coins minted in places like Samarkand and Baghdad. These were the payment for the furs and slaves that the Rus traders sent down the rivers. Ladoga was a melting pot. Scandinavians lived alongside Slavs, Finns, and traders from the south. They found runic inscriptions next to Arabic graffiti. The life of a Rus's trader based in Ladoga was hard and dangerous. A man like Rurik or his successor Oleg would have led expeditions that lasted for months. They would gather tribute from the local tribes, sometimes by force. This tribute was paid in furs, honey, and wax. In the spring, when the rivers thawed, they would load their ships. These were shallow draft vessels, long ships adapted for river travel. They could be sailed or rowed, and when they reached rapids, they could be dragged overland. The journey south on the Dnieper River was famous for its dangers. There were 7 major rapids to bypass, and the Pecheneg nomads, fierce steppe horsemen, often waited there to ambush the convoys. Constantine VII, the Byzantine emperor, described the Ruses and their trade in the 10th century. He wrote about how they would beach their ships, unload their goods, and carry everything for miles to get past the rapids. They were constantly on guard. If they made it through, they would reach the Black Sea and sail for Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, the Great City. There they sold their furs and slaves and bought silk, wine, and spices. They would return to Ladoga in the fall, rich men ready to start the cycle again. Rurik And his people were not just raiders, they were state builders. They established order along the rivers. They built forts or gorods at key points to protect their trade. Oleg later moved the capital south to a more strategic location, a place called Kiev. But Ladoga remained a vital center for trade and craft. It was the first foothold, the first place where the Norse presence in the east became permanent. They weren't Vikings in the traditional sense of raiding Western Europe. They were entrepreneurs, explorers, and mercenaries who saw opportunity in the vast, untapped wilderness of the East. They created a new identity, the Russes, a fusion of Scandinavian and Slavic cultures, and laid the foundation for a future empire, all starting from a small wooden fort on a riverbank. Number 19, their greatest city was built on a swamp. When Norse traders first sailed their ships up the rivers of what is now Russia, they looked for high, dry ground to build their forts. But one of their most important centers was different. They called it Holmgard, the island enclosure. Today it is known as Novgorod. The name Holmgard suggests it was built on an island or a series of islands in a marshy, low-lying area where the Volkhov River flows out of Lake Ilmen. It was a strategic mess, but it was a brilliant location for trade. Novgorod sat at a crucial crossroads. It controlled the northern end of the Dnieper trade route to Constantinople and the Volga trade route to the Caspian Sea and Baghdad. It was a nexus point. All the furs from the vast northern forest had to pass through here. A trader living in Holmgard in the 10th century, maybe a man named Svein, would not have seen a grand stone city. He would have seen a city of wood. Like the ground was so wet and boggy that the residents built wooden streets. They laid down logs side by side to create causeways, and when those sank into the mud, they just laid another layer on top. Archaeologists have dug down through more than 20 layers of these wooden streets, a timeline of the city's growth preserved in the waterlogged soil. The mud of Novgorod is a historical treasure chest. The anaerobic, oxygen-poor conditions have preserved organic materials that would have rotted away anywhere else. We have found leather shoes, wooden tools, and even musical instruments. Most importantly, we have found letters. Hundreds and hundreds of letters. They were not written on paper or parchment, but scratched onto pieces of birch bark with a sharp stylus. These birch bark letters give us an incredible glimpse into the daily life of the people of Holmgard. These were not grand royal decrees. They are shopping lists, business deals, love letters, and even a little boy's school lessons. As a boy named Onfim drew pictures of himself as a knight and practiced his alphabet on a piece of bark around the year 1250. We see merchants arguing over debts. We see a woman writing to her brother, complaining about a bad husband. We hear the voices of ordinary people. Many of these early letters and inscriptions are in Old Norse, written in runes. They show that the Scandinavian elite were still a powerful presence in the city for centuries. One 11th century stick has runes that read, "This is the staff of Sigtryg." Just a simple statement of ownership, a voice from 1,000 years ago. Life in Holmgard was run by trade. The city was a republic, ruled not by a single prince, but by a council of powerful merchants and landowners called the Veitch. A Norse merchant like Svein would have been part of this system. His wealth came from furs. He would have funded expeditions into the north, trading with the local tribes for sable and squirrel pelts. The currency was not always coins. Often, squirrel pelts themselves were a standard unit of value. They were bundled and stamped with a seal. This fur trade made Novgorod incredibly wealthy and independent. Unlike other Rus' cities, Novgorod was never sacked by the Mongols in the 13th century. Its marshy location and the timing of the invasion, which turned the surrounding area into an impassable swamp, saved it. It remained a sovereign city-state, a trading hub that looked as much to the west, to the Hanseatic League and the Baltic, as it did to the east. The Norse influence waned over time. The Russes intermarried with the local Slavic population, and their language and culture became dominant. But the foundations of the city, its name and its early commercial spirit, were born from those Scandinavian traders who saw opportunity in a swamp and built one of the great cities of the medieval world on log roads that slowly sank into the mud. Number 18. They became the personal bodyguards of an emperor. His name might have been Harald. He was tall, strong, and a long way from his home in Norway. It was the middle of the 11th century, and he was standing on the streets of Constantinople, the greatest city in the world. He called it Miklagard, the great city. To a man from a land of wooden farmsteads, it was overwhelming. The marble palaces, the massive dome of the Hagia Sophia, the crowds speaking dozens of languages, the smell of spices and sewage. Harald was not a trader or a pilgrim. He was a soldier, a mercenary. He was here to join the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard was the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor. It was formed around the year 988, when Emperor Basil II was facing a major rebellion. He was desperate. He sent a request for aid to Vladimir the Great, the Rus' Prince of Kiev. Vladimir sent him 6,000 Norse and Rus' warriors. They were brutal, effective, and fiercely loyal as long as they were paid. They crushed the rebellion. Basil was so impressed that he kept them on as his permanent guard. For the next 200 years, the Guard was the most formidable military unit in the Byzantine army, and it was composed almost entirely of Scandinavians. For a young man in Norway, Sweden, or Iceland, joining the Varangian Guard was a path to fame and fortune. It was a dangerous life, but the rewards were immense. The pay was high, and they had the right to Plutasvarf, a legal looting of the imperial palace whenever an emperor died. They would rush in and grab whatever treasures they could carry. Many Varangians returned home as incredibly wealthy men. Runic inscriptions back in Sweden attest to this. One runestone reads, "He died in the east in the Guard." Another says, "A man had gained gold in Garderic, Luxrusha, and in Greece." It was a known career path. Or Harald would have had to prove his worth. The Guard wanted the best. They fought with a distinctive weapon, a long, heavy, two-handed battle axe called a romphia. They were known for their discipline and their terrifying battle cries. They stood guard at the palace, their axes gleaming. They accompanied the emperor to church, and they fought on the front lines of his wars from Sicily to Syria. They were often the last line of defense, a wall of steel and fury that turned the tide of battle. The most famous Varangian of all was Harald Sigurdsson, later known as Harald Hardrada, or Hard Ruler. He fled Norway as a young man and came to Constantinople around 1034. He joined the Guard and quickly rose through the ranks. He, fought for the emperor in the Mediterranean against pirates, in Sicily against the Arabs, and in Bulgaria. The sagas say he became the commander of the Guard and amassed a colossal fortune. He supposedly had to send his gold back to Kiev for safekeeping because there was too much to carry. He eventually returned to Norway with his wealth, seized the throne, and became king. In 1066, this same Harald Hardrada invaded England, where he was finally killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, just weeks before William the Conqueror arrived. His life story, from fugitive to Varangian commander to king of Norway, was the ultimate dream for many young Scandinavians. But not everyone made it home. Life in the Guard was brutal. They fought in harsh campaigns and were often at the center of bloody palace intrigue. The graffiti they left behind tells a more personal story. In the upper gallery of the Hagia Sophia, you can still see runes scratched into the marble balustrade. One simply says, "Halfdan was here." It is a simple human mark, a soldier bored during a long ceremony, leaving his name in the grandest church in Christendom. It connects us directly to that young man from the north, a member of an elite corps of Viking mercenaries who served a foreign emperor a long way from the fjords and fields of home. Number 17, they built a kingdom on an island of slaves. The Isle of Man sits in the middle of the Irish Sea. It is a small, hilly island, just 52 kilometers long and 22 kilometers wide. Today it is a quiet place, a self-governing crown dependency known for its motorcycle races and Teus cats. But for 300 years, it was the center of a powerful Norse kingdom, a sea kingdom that controlled the waves and the trade routes connecting Ireland, Scotland, England, and Scandinavia. The Vikings first arrived on the Isle of Man around the year 800. At first, they were raiders. The island was an easy target, and it had a wealthy Celtic monastery at Moghold. But they soon realized its strategic value. It was a perfect base. From here, a fleet could strike anywhere in the Irish Sea within a day's sail. They began to settle. They intermarried with the local Manx Gaelic population. They established farms and trading posts. This fusion of Norse and Gaelic culture created a unique society, the Norse Gaels. The most visible legacy of this time is the Tynwald. The Parliament of the Isle of Man, the Tynwald, is the oldest continuously operating parliament in the world. Its name comes from the Old Norse Thingvalar, meaning assembly field. This was the system the Vikings brought with them everywhere they settled. It was an open-air assembly where all free men could gather to make laws, settle disputes, and elect leaders. The Tynwald on the Isle of Man still meets once a year on Tynwald Hill, a man-made, four-tiered mound to proclaim the laws of the land in both Manx and English. The very structure of their government is a direct inheritance from the Norse settlers. For much of its Norse period, the island was part of the Kingdom of the Isles, a domain that included the Hebrides of Scotland. But its golden age came under a dynasty founded by a man named Godred Crovan. He conquered the island in 1079. Godred, known in Manx legend as King Ori, was a powerful sea king. He not only ruled Man and the Hebrides, but also conquered Dublin and parts of Leinster in Ireland. From his capital at Castle Rushen on the Isle of Man, he controlled the sea lanes. His kingdom was not based on land, but on ships. The power of a king was measured by the number of longships he could command. Life on the island was a mix of farming, fishing, and trade. But there was a darker side to the economy. The Irish Sea was a major hub of the slave trade, and the Norse Gaels of Man were at its heart. His raids on Ireland and Britain were not just for plunder, they were for people. Captives were brought back to the Isle of Man, and then sold in markets in Dublin or further afield. The Norse name for a slave was a thrall. The economy of this sea kingdom was built in part on human trafficking. The archaeological record on the island is rich. The most stunning finds are the Manx crosses. These are large carved stone slabs that served as grave markers or monuments. They are unique because they blend Christian imagery with Norse mythology. You can see a Christian cross on the same stone as a depiction of Odin being devoured by the wolf Fenrir at Ragnarok, or a carving of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. These stones show how the settlers converted to Christianity but did not abandon their old stories. They simply blended the two worlds together. The names carved on the stones are a mix of Norse and Gaelic Thorleif Dugald Onora. The Kingdom of Man and the Isles eventually fell. In 1266, after years of pressure from a resurgent Scotland, the last Norse king of Man ceded the island to the Scottish crown. The 3 centuries of Norse rule came to an end, but their influence never left. It remains in the place names like Ramsey Wild Garlic River and Snaefell Snow Mountain. It remains in the Tynwald, and it remains in the carved stones that tell stories of gods and heroes, a testament to a time when this small island was the heart of a vibrant, powerful, and often brutal sea kingdom. Number 16, the people who forgot they were Vikings. In the far north of Scotland, beyond the mainland, lies an archipelago of about 70 islands. These are the Orkney Islands. For 500 years, they were not part of Scotland. They were a Norse earldom, a vibrant part of the Scandinavian world. The Norse influence was so total that the original Pictish language of the islands vanished completely. It was replaced by an Old Norse dialect called Norn, which was spoken in Orkney until the 18th century. The people of Orkney effectively became Norse. The Vikings arrived in Orkney around the end of the 8th century. The islands were a perfect stepping stone for raids on Scotland, Ireland, and England, but they quickly became a place of settlement. The land was fertile, much better than much of western Norway. They brought their families, their livestock, their laws, and their language. They established farms with names that are still in use today: Hobbister, Quailu, Grimeston. They built longhouses and established their thing, or assembly, where the Earls of Orkney ruled. The story of the Orkney earldom is told in the Orkney Inga saga, a brilliant and bloody history of the men who ruled these islands. It is a tale of feuding, politics, and larger-than-life characters. One of the most powerful was Thorfinn the Mighty, who ruled in the 11th century. The saga says he controlled 9 earldoms in Scotland, all of the Hebrides, and a large part of Ireland. He was a classic Viking chieftain, a warrior, and a strategist, but he was also a Christian. He went on a pilgrimage to Rome, and on his return built the first cathedral in Orkney at Bursay. The most famous building in Orkney is St. Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall. It was started in 1137 by Earl Rungvald Kali Coulson in honor of his uncle Magnus Erlendsson. Magnus was a pious and peaceful earl who was murdered by his rival cousin Hakon Paulson on the island of Eaglesay. Miracles were reported at his grave, and he was made a saint. The cathedral, built of striking red and yellow sandstone, is known as the Light in the North. It is one of the finest medieval buildings in Britain, and it was built by the Norse. Inside the cathedral, there is a secret. In the 19th century, during restoration work, a hidden compartment was found in one of the pillars. Inside was a wooden box containing the bones of a man. The skull had a large wound, consistent with a blow from an axe. These are believed to be the relics of Saint Magnus himself. But there is another, more informal record inside the cathedral. High up on the pillars of the choir, a group of Norsemen took shelter during a snowstorm in the 12th century. They were bored, so they carved graffiti into the soft sandstone. These are the largest collection of runic inscriptions found outside of Scandinavia. They are not profound religious statements. One says, "These runes were carved by the man most skilled in runes in the Western Ocean." Another is a crudely drawn dragon. They are the casual markings of Viking crusaders, likely on their way to the Holy Land, who left their names and jokes in the holiest place in their homeland. Orkney was officially transferred from Norway to Scotland in 1468. It was not a conquest. It was part of a dowry. The Danish and Norwegian king Christian I pawned the islands to King James III of Scotland to raise money for his daughter's wedding. The pledge was never redeemed. The islands became Scottish. Over time, the Norn language faded, replaced by Scots. The ties to Scandinavia weakened. The people of Orkney became Scots. But the Norse heritage is everywhere. It is in the DNA of the people studies show a high percentage of Scandinavian ancestry. It is in the place names, the flag, and the stories they tell. For centuries, the people of Orkney were Norse. They were not just a forgotten settlement, they were a central part of the Viking world, a powerful earldom whose people slowly, over centuries, forgot that they had ever been anything but Scottish. Number 15, an island fortress of pirate brothers. On the coast of what is now Poland, near the mouth of the Oder River, there was an island city called Wollin. In the 10th and 11th centuries, it was a massive multicultural trading hub, rivaling Hedeby in Denmark. It was a city of 10,000 people, a giant for its time. Slavic, Scandinavian, and Baltic people lived and traded here. The sagas tell of a legendary fortress in this area, a place called Jomsborg. It was the headquarters of a fearsome band of elite mercenary Vikings, the Jomsvikings. The story of the Jomsvikings is part history, part legend. According to the sagas, they were a military brotherhood, bound by a strict code of conduct. To join, a man had to be between 18 and 50 and of proven strength. No man could flee from a lesser opponent. Every man had to avenge his brother Jomsviking as he would his own kin. All booty was to be shared equally. They were pirates and soldiers for hire, selling their services to the highest bidder. They were famous for their ferocity and their absolute refusal to show fear. Their fortress at Jomsborg was said to be a marvel. It had a large artificial harbor that could be closed off with a great iron gate. A stone tower was built over the gate, equipped with catapults. The harbor was supposedly large enough to hold 300 longships at once. From this base, the Jomsvikings terrorized the Baltic. They raided, traded, and fought for kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The leader of the Jomsvikings was a chieftain, and one of the most famous was Styrbjorn the Strong, a claimant to the Swedish throne who used the Brotherhood as his private army. The reality of Jomsborg is debated by historians. No definitive archaeological evidence of the legendary fortress has been found at Wollin. But the city of Wollin itself was certainly real and very important. Excavations have revealed a huge settlement with extensive docks, craft workshops, and defenses. They have found goods from all over the world, English coins, Kievan pottery, Byzantine silks, and they have found a great deal of Scandinavian material, including weapons, jewelry, and runestones, indicating a strong Norse presence. It is very likely that Wollin was a major base for Viking warriors, and that the legends of Jomsborg grew out of the reality of this powerful, cosmopolitan, and dangerous city. One of the most famous stories about the Jomsvikings describes their defeat at the Battle of Hjörungavágr in Norway around the year 986. They had been hired to overthrow the Norwegian ruler, Earl Hakon. They were defeated. The saga tells a dramatic story of the captured Jomsviking, who they were lined up to be executed. They showed no fear. One warrior, when asked if he was afraid to die, supposedly said, "No, but I'm curious to see if I will be able to pick up my head after you've cut it off." Another, seeing the executioner had long hair, asked him not to get any blood on it. A third supposedly asked to be beheaded quickly, as they had a rule in Jomsborg against dying slowly. Whether these stories are true or not, they created a powerful image of the ideal Viking warrior. The Jomsvikings became the model for later chivalric orders. The legend of a disciplined, fearless brotherhood of warriors living by their own code in an impregnable fortress was a powerful one. The city of Wollin was eventually destroyed by the Danes in the 12th century. Its importance faded. The historical reality of the city and the semi-legendary fortress of Jomsborg merged and were largely forgotten. But for a time, this island on the Polish coast was home to one of the most feared and respected groups of warriors in the Viking world, a pirate republic that lived by the sword. Number 14, the Northmen who became French. In the year 911, a Viking chieftain named Rollo sailed his fleet up the Seine River and laid siege to the city of Paris. It was not the first time. Vikings had been raiding this part of France, which they called West Francia, for decades. They had sacked Paris before. They were a persistent, destructive menace. The king of West Francia, Charles the Simple, was weak. His army could not defeat them, so he decided to try something different. He offered Rollo a deal. Charles offered Rollo a huge swath of land at the mouth of the Seine River. In return, Rollo had to do two things. First, he had to convert to Christianity and be baptized. Second, and more importantly, he had to become a vassal of the king and defend the kingdom from any future Viking attacks. He had to become the guard dog instead of the wolf. Rollo agreed. In the Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte, the Viking leader became Robert, the first Duke of Normandy. The land he was given became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. This was not a small settlement. It was a wholesale colonization. Thousands of Scandinavian settlers, mostly Danes, but also Norwegians, followed Rollo. They came with their families, their laws, and their language. For the first few generations, Normandy was essentially a Viking state on French soil. The place names tell the story. Towns ending in Beck come from the Old Norse Becker stream. Those ending in Flor come from Floth River. The capital, Rouen, became the center of this new duchy, but something remarkable happened. These Northmen, these Vikings, began to change. They adapted very quickly. They adopted the Christian religion, not just in name, but in practice. They became great patrons of the church, founding monasteries and abbeys. They abandoned their Old Norse language within 2 or 3 generations and began speaking the local French dialect. They intermarried with the local Frankish women. The sagas tell us that Rollo himself took the daughter of a local count as his wife. They adopted French feudal customs, French military technology, and French law. They became, for all intents and purposes, French. But they did not forget who they were. They retained a distinct Norman identity. They were known for their energy, their ambition, and their military prowess. They were the Vikings in French armor. This energy could not be contained within Normandy. They needed more land, more opportunity. And so they began to expand. In the 11th century, Norman adventurers, the descendants of Rollo's Vikings, set out to conquer new lands. A group of brothers from the de Hauteville family traveled to southern Italy as mercenaries and ended up conquering it from the Byzantines and Arabs, creating the powerful Kingdom of Sicily. And most famously, in 1066, William, the Duke of Normandy, a direct descendant of the Viking Rollo, claimed the throne of England. And he assembled a massive fleet and army, crossed the English Channel and defeated the English king Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. William the Conqueror and his Norman knights took over England. They built castles, established a new aristocracy, and changed the English language forever. The King of England was now a French-speaking descendant of Vikings. The settlement of Normandy is a story of incredible transformation. The Vikings who came to raid stayed to build a state. They assimilated with such speed and success that within 150 years, they had gone from being a pagan terror to being the standard bearers of French Christian culture and military power. They were so successful that their own Viking origins were almost forgotten, overshadowed by their later achievements as Normans. The duchy they founded became one of the most dynamic and powerful states in Europe, a political and cultural engine driven by the restless energy of its Viking founders. Number 13, they found a paradise of green, and then it froze. When Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland in 982 for killing a few of his neighbors, he needed a place to go. He had heard stories of a large land to the west sighted years earlier by a sailor named Gunnbjorn. Eric gathered a crew and ships and set out. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring this new land. He found a region of deep fjords with green, grassy slopes at their heads. Compared to the volcanic landscape of Iceland, it looked promising. When he returned to Iceland, he needed to convince people to come with him and start a new colony. So he gave the land a good name. He called it Greenland. It was a brilliant piece of marketing. In 985, a fleet of 25 ships left Iceland for Greenland, filled with settlers and their livestock. Only 14 made it. The rest were sunk or turned back, but the ones who arrived established a new society. They created 2 main settlement areas, the larger eastern settlement in the south, where Eric himself built his farm at Brattahlid, and the smaller western settlement further north. At its peak, the Norse Greenland colony had a population of around 3,000 to 5,000 people. They built over 400 farms, 17 churches, a monastery, and a convent. They even had their own bishop. For nearly 500 years, this was a functioning, if remote, European society. The Greenlanders saw themselves as farmers. They brought their cows, sheep, and goats with them. The sagas describe Eric the Red's wife, Jodhild, as being reluctant to leave Iceland because of her Christian faith. He built her a small church at Brattahlid, the first church in the new land. The remains of this tiny turf-walled church have been found. They were Christians living at the very edge of the known world. They built their farms deep in the fjords where the climate was milder. They cut the turf to build their houses and grew hay in the short summer to feed their animals through the long, dark winter. But they were not just farmers. They had to adapt. The land was not as green as the name suggested. Farming was always a struggle. So they became hunters. The archaeological evidence from their middens, or trash heaps, shows that as time went on, their diet shifted more and more from farmed animals to food from the sea. They ate vast quantities of seal. Seals provided meat, blubber for fuel, and waterproof skins. They also organized huge communal hunts far to the north for walrus. Walrus tusks and hides were their main export, their connection to Europe. They traded this white gold for iron, tools, and church finery. They were a hybrid society, European farmers living an Arctic hunter's life. Then they disappeared. The last written record from the Greenland colony is a letter describing a wedding at a Valsey church in the eastern settlement in 1408. After that, silence. When a ship finally arrived again over a century later, the settlements were empty. The churches were in ruins. The farms were overgrown. For centuries, the fate of the Greenland Norse was a complete mystery. Theories ranged from pirate attacks to a plague. The truth, as revealed by archaeology and ice core data, is more complex and tragic. It was a slow decline, not a sudden catastrophe. The climate began to change. The medieval warm period, which had made the initial settlement possible, gave way to the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped. The summers became shorter and cooler, making it harder to grow enough hay for the livestock. The sea ice increased, choking the fjords and making both travel and seal hunting more difficult. Their connection to Norway and Iceland was severed as the northern sea routes became more treacherous. The last ship from Norway probably arrived in the early 15th century. They were also culturally conservative. They clung to their European farming identity even when it was no longer sustainable. They did not adopt the technology of the local Inuit people, like the toggle harpoon or the skin kayak, which were far better suited for the changing environment. The Inuit, who were expanding south as the climate cooled, were thriving. The Norse were not. Malnutrition became common. Skeletons from the later period show signs of disease and stunted growth. Faced with a cooling climate, economic isolation, and a failing way of life, the population slowly dwindled. The last Greenlanders likely died out or possibly tried to sail away, their fate unknown. They did not vanish in a dramatic storm or battle. They simply faded away, a lonely European society that could no longer survive on a frozen paradise. Number 12. The river was their highway and their grave. The Dnieper River flows south through Ukraine to the Black Sea. For the Rus's Vikings, it was the main artery of their trade route to the riches of the Byzantine Empire. But it was not an easy highway. A long stretch of the river, about 70 kilometers, was blocked by a series of 7 major rapids. For the heavily loaded trading ships of the Russes, these rapids were a deadly obstacle course. A Rus's trader, let's call him Ivar, would have started his journey in the spring from Kiev, the city they called Kanagarder. His flotilla of monoxula, ships carved from single tree trunks, would be laden with the winter's collection of furs, honey, wax, and slaves. The trip down the smooth upper river was easy. Then they would reach the rapids. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus wrote a detailed description of this journey in the 10th century. He even gave the Norse and Slavic names for each of the 7 rapids. The first rapid was called Asupi, which meant do not sleep. It was a warning. Here, the river narrowed and rocks churned the water. But it was passable. The real trouble began at the 4th rapid, Ifor, the ever fierce. Here, the traders had to make a choice. They could try to pole their way through the shallows near the bank, a risky maneuver. Or they could do what was necessary for the worst rapids they had to get out of the river entirely. This was an immense labor. Ivar and his crew would have to unload every single bale of fur, every barrel of honey, every person from the ships. The slaves, chained together, would be marched along the bank. The crew would then have to drag their heavy ships out of the water and pull them overland on log rollers for miles. It was back-breaking work, and it was incredibly dangerous. The local Pecheneg nomads, fierce horsemen of the steppe, knew the Russes were vulnerable here. They would lie in wait, ready to ambush the exhausted traders. Guards had to be posted at all times. Constantine wrote that the Russes never put down their weapons during the portage. After bypassing one rapid, they would reload the ships, get back in the river, and paddle to the next one, only to repeat the process. The 7th and final rapid, Strokun, the small rapid, was the last major hurdle. Once they were past it, they could sail to the island of St. George, where they would rest. They would make sacrifices, often of live roosters, at a giant oak tree, giving thanks to their gods for a safe passage. From there, it was open water to the Black Sea and the great city of Constantinople. Not everyone made it. The river was a graveyard for ships and men. In 972, the Rus's Prince Sviatoslav, returning from a campaign against the Byzantines, was ambushed and killed by the Pechenegs at the rapids. The Pecheneg Khan, according to the Chronicle, had Sviatoslav's skull made into a drinking cup and gilded it with gold. It was a stark reminder of the dangers of the river. Archaeologists have found evidence of this perilous journey. On the island of Khortytsia, near the old rapids, a 10th century Viking sword was found. It was a high-status weapon, intricately decorated, not something a warrior would lose lightly. It was likely lost in a battle, or perhaps during a shipwreck in the churning water. It is a single object that speaks of the violence and risk that were a constant part of life on the river. The rapids were a filter. Only the strongest, luckiest, and best organized traders made it through. They were the ones who reached Miklagard and returned rich. The Dnieper Rapids were a forgotten, brutal obstacle that shaped the flow of trade and power in Eastern Europe, a place where fortunes were made and lives were lost. Number 11. The wolf lived on the banks of the Tyne. In the year 866, a massive Viking army landed in England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it the Michael here, the Great Heathen Army. It was different from the earlier hit-and-run raids. This army came to stay. For the next decade, it rampaged across the kingdoms of England, conquering Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. In 876, one of its leaders, a man named Halfdan, led his part of the army north to the River Tyne. The Chronicle states that he shared out the land of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plow and to support themselves. This was a turning point. The Viking raiders were becoming settlers. They were putting down their swords and picking up plows. So they took over the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria and created a new Norse kingdom centered on the city of York, which they called Jorvik. But settlements spread far beyond the capital. One significant area of settlement was along the Tyne River in what is now Tyneside. Here, a powerful Norse warlord, whose name is lost to history but who was associated with a wolf symbol, may have established his base. Archaeological evidence for this is subtle but compelling. In the 19th century, a hoard of Viking silver was discovered at Curedale in Lancashire. It contained over 8,600 items, including coins from all over the Viking world. Some of these coins were minted in the new kingdom of Northumbria. One unique type of coin, the St. Peter's penny, was struck at York, but another type, which has been found scattered around Tyneside, is different. It doesn't have a Christian symbol. Instead, it has a wolf on it with its head turned back and its tongue sticking out. This has led to the theory that a local, independent Viking chieftain, the Wolf King, was ruling a splinter territory on the Tyne, minting his own currency. Life for a Norse settler on the Tyne would have been a blend of old and new. A man named Thorstein might have taken over an existing Anglo-Saxon farm. He would have lived alongside the English population, who were now his subjects. He would have learned new farming techniques suited to the local soil, but he would have kept his Norse language, his laws, and his cultural identity. Place names in the area show this mixing. The town of Howden comes from Hoveden, the headland in Old Norse. Walker comes from Walker, a place for fulling cloth. These were working people establishing new communities. They also brought their beliefs. Near the church in Badal, a beautifully carved stone was found. It is the gravestone of a Viking warrior. It shows his weapons and armor, but it also shows figures from Norse mythology. It depicts the story of Wayland the Smith, a famous magical blacksmith. This shows that even after they began to accept Christianity, they held on to their ancestral stories. Another fascinating find is a hogback tombstone from the church at Gosforth. It is shaped like a Norse longhouse and is covered in carvings that mix Christian scenes, like the crucifixion, with scenes from Ragnarok, the Viking apocalypse. One side shows the god Vidar killing the Fenris wolf. This blending of beliefs was typical of the settlements. They didn't see a contradiction. The kingdom of Northumbria, including the smaller territories like the one on the Tyne, was eventually conquered by the English king Athelstan in 927. The Norse rule was short-lived, lasting only a few generations, but the impact was permanent. The settlers remained. They intermarried with the English. Their language enriched the local dialect with hundreds of Norse words. Words like bairn for child and stoat for bounce are remnants of the Norse language spoken on the time. The forgotten settlement of the Wolf King was absorbed, but it left its mark in the land, in the language, and in the DNA of the people who live there today. Number 10. The first king of Dublin was a warlord named Thorgils. In the year 837, a fleet of 60 Viking longships sailed up the River Liffey in Ireland. This was not unusual, for Vikings had been raiding the Irish coast for 40 years. But this fleet was different. It did not raid and leave. It stayed. Over the next few years, the Norse established a fortified naval base on the south bank of the river, at a spot where a dark pool, a Dubh Linn, met the main river. This camp, or Longfort, became the city of Dublin. The traditional founder of Viking Dublin, according to later Irish annals, was a chieftain named Turgesius, or Thorgils in Norse. He was described as a brutal and ambitious leader who sought to conquer all of Ireland. He established fortified bases across the country and plundered the great Irish monasteries like Clonmacnoise. The annals say he even placed his wife, Ota, on the high altar of Clonmacnoise, where she gave her prophecies. He was eventually captured by the Irish king of Meath and drowned in a lake. While the story of Thorgils is likely exaggerated, it reflects the reality of the early settlement. It was a violent military occupation. The early settlement at Dublin was a winter base for a Viking army. Archaeologists have excavated the site now in the area around Dublin Castle. They found the remains of post and plank houses, workshops, and defensive ditches. They found huge numbers of artifacts, amber from the Baltic, silk from the east, walrus ivory from Greenland. It was a thriving cosmopolitan port, and it was a center of the slave trade. Raids deep into the Irish Midlands brought back captives who were sold in the Dublin slave market. The Irish word for a female slave, cumal, became a unit of currency. Life for a Norse settler in 9th century Dublin was precarious. A warrior named Olaf might live in a small wooden house inside the defensive walls. By day, he might work as a craftsman, making combs from deer antler or repairing ships. But he had to be ready to fight at a moment's notice. The settlement was an island of Norse power in a hostile Gaelic sea. The Irish kings constantly fought back. Dublin was attacked, burned, and even abandoned for a period in the early 10th century. But the Vikings returned and rebuilt. The city they built became the most important economic center in Ireland. They were skilled traders and craftsmen. They introduced the concept of a money-based economy to Ireland, minting their own silver pennies. The Dublin penny, with the name of its Norse king, Sitric Silkbeard, was widely circulated and copied. They were also master shipbuilders and navigators. The Dublin fleet controlled the Irish Sea. Over time, the relationship with the Irish changed. The Norse of Dublin began to intermarry with the local population. They converted to Christianity. The Norse kings of Dublin became part of the complex web of Irish politics, making alliances with Irish kings and fighting against other Irish kings. They became the Hiberno Norse, a people of mixed heritage. They still spoke Old Norse, but many also spoke Irish. They had names like Olaf Cuaran, a king who ruled both Dublin and the Norse kingdom of York. The Great Battle of Clontarf in 1014 is often portrayed as the battle where the Irish High King Brian Boru drove the Vikings out of Ireland. This is a myth. The battle was actually a complex conflict where Brian Boru's army fought against an alliance of the Dublin Vikings and their Irish allies from Leinster. Brian Boru won the battle, but was killed. The Vikings of Dublin were defeated, but were not driven out. They remained in their city and continued to rule it for another 150 years. They had become an integral part of Ireland. The forgotten settlement was not forgotten at all. It just stopped being a Viking settlement and became a city, the city of Dublin, whose foundations were laid by those raiders who decided to stay. Number 9, they sailed south until the butter melted. The Vikings are famous for their voyages across the cold North Atlantic, but they also sailed south into the warm waters of Spain and the Mediterranean. Their name for the Iberian Peninsula was Hispania. Their first encounters were not for settlement, but for plunder. In 844, a large Viking fleet sailed up the Guadalquivir River in modern Spain, which was then the heart of the powerful Umayyad Emirate of Al-Andalus. They sacked the city of Seville, shocking the Muslim world. The emir, Abd al-Rahman II, responded quickly. He raised an army, defeated the Vikings in a bloody battle, and forced them to retreat. He then built up his navy and coastal defenses to prevent a repeat attack. But the Vikings kept coming back. Over the next 2 centuries, they launched several major raids on the coasts of Spain and Portugal. They were not just mindless pillagers, they were strategic. They learned to establish temporary bases, island strongholds where they could spend the winter, repair their ships, and gather their forces. One such base was the island of Noirmoutier off the Atlantic coast of France. From here, they could launch raids south. Another potential base was in the Ria de Arousa, a large estuary in Galicia in northwest Spain. A Viking on one of these southern voyages, a man named Bjorn Ironside, according to legend, would have experienced a world utterly alien to him. The sun was hotter, the sea was warmer. He saw strange plants like olive trees and grapevines. He fought against disciplined professional armies, not the peasant levies he was used to in England or Ireland. The cities were filled with stone buildings and mosques, not wooden halls. The sagas contain a phrase that captures this sense of distance they sailed south, until the butter they had brought with them from home melted. It was a simple practical measure of how far they were from their own world. In 859, a fleet led by the legendary figures Hastin and Bjorn Ironside sailed from France. They raided the coasts of Spain and Portugal, then passed through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, a sea they called Jorsalahaf, the Sea of Jerusalem. They were the first Vikings to do so. They raided the Balearic Islands, the coast of North Africa, and southern France. They even sailed up the Arno River in Italy and sacked the city of Pisa. They reportedly intended to sack Rome, but mistook another city, Luna, for it. They captured Luna through a trick. Hastin pretended to be on his deathbed and asked for a Christian burial inside the city walls. And once his coffin and his armed honor guard were inside, he leaped out, and his men opened the gates for the rest of the army. These were not settlement voyages. They were long-distance raids, some lasting for years. The men who went on them were professional pirates. But there is some evidence of a more lasting presence. In Galicia, local traditions speak of Viking settlements. The town of Katora still holds an annual festival that reenacts the Viking landings. While direct archaeological proof of a permanent farmstead is lacking, it is highly likely that the Vikings established long-term camps that they used for years at a time. These camps were bases for trading as well as raiding. They traded furs and slaves for the silver and spices of the south. The impact of these raids was significant. They forced the rulers of Al-Andalus and the small Christian kingdoms of the north to invest heavily in naval power and coastal defense. They also opened up new lines of communication. Some Vikings may have stayed. The sagas speak of men who entered the service of local rulers as mercenaries. In the 11th century, a group of Scandinavian crusaders helped the King of Portugal capture the city of Lisbon from the Moors. The Viking presence in Hispania was mostly fleeting and violent, a series of forgotten camps on hostile shores. But it showed the incredible range of their ships and the ambition of their leaders who were willing to sail to the very edge of their known world and beyond in search of wealth. Number 8. An island of hermits became an island of warriors. Before the Vikings arrived, the Shetland Islands, a remote archipelago north of Scotland, were inhabited by the Picts. There were also, according to the Irish monk de Keele, writing around 825, a few Irish hermits. He wrote that these holy men had sought solitude on the northern islands, but had been driven out by the arrival of the Norse pirates. The quiet, prayerful life of the islands was about to be replaced by something very different. Shetland was one of the first places the Vikings settled. It was close to their homes in western Norway, just a day's sail in a good wind. The islands were a perfect base for raiding further south. But more than that, they were a new home. The landscape was familiar, treeless, windswept, with deep fjords, which they called voses. The land was good enough for farming oats and raising sheep. The Norse colonization of Shetland was total. They came in such numbers that they completely displaced the native Picts. The Pictish language and culture vanished, leaving only a few mysterious ruins. The language of Shetland became Old Norse. A new settler, a farmer named Magnus, might have arrived in the 9th century. He would have chosen a spot for his farm, probably one already cleared by the Picts. He would have built a longhouse, a single long building where his family and his animals lived under one roof. He would have planted his crops and let his sheep roam the hills. His life would have been governed by the seasons and the sea. The sea provided fish, a vital part of the diet. It was also the highway for trade and travel. The most spectacular Viking settlement ever found in Britain is at Jarlshof on the southern tip of the Shetland mainland. Archaeologists have uncovered an entire village that was occupied for centuries. You can walk through the remains of several Norse longhouses, byres for the animals, and even a smithy. The site shows how the settlement evolved over time. As houses were rebuilt and adapted, they found soapstone bowls, bone combs, and loom weights, the everyday objects of a community that lived and worked here for 400 years. Shetland was not a backwater, it was a central part of the Norse earldom of Orkney, and a key stop on the Great Sea Route that connected Norway with Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Ships sailing west would stop in Shetland to take on supplies and wait for favorable winds. This meant the Shetlanders were connected to the wider Viking world. They heard news from far away. Their sons might go off to serve the Earl of Orkney in a war, or to seek their fortune in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople. The system of law was Norse. The Shetlanders held their own local assemblies, or things, to settle disputes. The main assembly for all of Shetland was held at a place called Tingwall. The name itself means assembly field. This system of Norse feudal law, where land was owned by families in perpetuity, not granted by a feudal lord, survived in Shetland long after the islands became Scottish. Like Orkney, Shetland was pledged to Scotland in 1469 as part of a royal dowry and was never redeemed. The islands became Scottish. The Old Norse language, Norn, slowly died out, though it survived in some remote areas until the 19th century. But it left behind thousands of words in the local Shetland dialect. The place names are almost entirely Norse. Scalloway is Skallivagr, the bay with the halls. Lerwick is Lervik, the muddy bay. The heritage is deep. The quiet islands that were once a refuge for hermits became a Norse stronghold, a forgotten corner of the Scandinavian world, whose legacy is carved into the very landscape itself. Here's number 7. They buried their dead in ships on a Black Sea beach. Berezan Island is a small, windswept spit of land in the Black Sea, just off the coast of modern Ukraine, near the mouth of the Dnieper River. Today it is uninhabited, home only to birds and archaeologists, but in the age of the Vikings, it was a vital, bustling outpost. For the Ruse's traders making the dangerous journey down the river from Kiev to Constantinople, Berezan was the first safe harbor after the open sea. It was a place to rest, repair ships, and prepare for the final leg of the journey to the great city. The Norse called it the island of St. Ethereos. It was a seasonal settlement, most active during the summer trading season. A trader arriving from the north, having survived the Dnieper Rapids and the threat of Pecheneg attack, would have seen Berezan as a sanctuary. Here he could pull his ship onto the beach, make repairs, and trade with the Greeks who also used the island as a meeting point. It was a place where the world of the northern forests met the world of the Mediterranean. Archaeologists have found evidence of this mixed community. They have uncovered the remains of pit houses and workshops. They have found Scandinavian brooches and amulets shaped like Thor's hammer, lying alongside Byzantine pottery and coins. It was a frontier town, a place of exchange. They traded their northern goods, furs, slaves, honey for the wine, oil, and silk of the south. But Berezan was more than just a truck stop on the trade route. It was a sacred place. This is where we find one of the most remarkable pieces of evidence for the Viking presence in the East. In 1905, an archaeologist discovered a runestone on the island. This was incredible. Runestones are common in Scandinavia, but extremely rare this far from home. The stone is a grave marker. The runes, carved in the 11th century, read, "Grani made this mound in memory of Karl, his partner." This simple inscription tells a powerful story. Grani and Karl were Filagi, partners in a business venture, probably a trading expedition. They had made the long journey from their home, perhaps the island of Gotland in Sweden, which was a major trading center. Karl died here on this remote Black Sea island. His partner Grani did not just bury him and leave. He went to the trouble of finding a suitable stone and carving a formal memorial in their own language and script. Well, it was an act of remembrance, a way of marking this foreign land with their own identity. It tells us that these were not just faceless traders. They were individuals with names and relationships who cared about honoring their dead even thousands of miles from home. The burial practices on Berezan also show the blending of cultures. Some graves are classic Scandinavian burials with the dead laid out with their weapons or tools. Some are even ship burials where the deceased was placed in a boat, a symbolic vessel for the journey to the afterlife. This was a pagan practice, but other graves on the island are Christian, aligned east-west, with no grave goods. This shows that as the Russes converted to Christianity, their rituals changed. Berezan was a place in transition, where old beliefs and new faiths existed side by side. The island's importance faded as other Black Sea ports grew, and as the trade routes shifted, the settlement was abandoned and forgotten. But the runestone of Grani and Karl remains. It is a lonely, poignant message from the past, a single stone that speaks of partnership, loss, and the incredible reach of the Viking traders who made this small, barren island a temporary home. Number 6, the land of flat stones was a stepping stone to America. When Leif Erikson followed Bjarni Herjolfsson's route west from Greenland around the year 1000, the first land he encountered was a barren place of rock and ice. The sagas say he went ashore and saw no grass great ice mountains lay inland, but it was all a rock flat land from the sea to the ice mountains. Because of this, he named it Helluland, the land of flat stones. For a long time, historians and archaeologists have identified Helluland as Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. For years, it was assumed that the Norse just saw Helluland and sailed on. It was not a place to settle. It was cold, treeless, and inhabited by the ancestors of the modern Inuit, a people the Norse would have found very different from the natives they met further south in Vinland. But recent archaeological discoveries have changed this picture. The Norse did not just sail past Helluland. They stopped, they stayed, they set up camps. In the 1960s, archaeologists working on Baffin Island and in northern Labrador began finding strange objects at ancient Dorset and Thule culture sites, the predecessors of the Inuit. They found small pieces of spun yarn made from Arctic hare fur, woven in a distinctively Norse style. They found whetstones for sharpening metal tools made of a stone not native to the area. They found small wooden sticks carved with European-style notches that look like tally sticks for counting. The most significant find came from the Nanook site on southern Baffin Island. It was a small stone crucible, a pot for melting metal. Inside the crucible were tiny flecks of bronze and glass. The Dorset people did not have metallurgy. They were a Stone Age culture. This crucible must have been used by the Norse, probably to melt down bronze objects to be reshaped into tools or ornaments. This was physical proof of a Norse presence, a workshop right in the heart of Helluland. Why were they there? They weren't farming. They were not building settlements like Lanzio's Meadows. They were there for resources, just as they were in Markland and Vinland. But the resources were different. The Canadian Arctic was rich in things that were valuable to the Greenlanders. One major resource was driftwood. Greenland had almost no trees, and wood was always in short supply. The currents in the Arctic carry huge amounts of driftwood from the great rivers of Siberia and North America, and it piles up on the shores of Baffin Island. The Norse could have harvested this wood for building and repairs. They were also likely trading with the local people, whom the sagas call Skraelings. The Norse had things the locals wanted, especially metal. A small piece of iron for a knife blade or a harpoon tip would have been incredibly valuable. In return, the Norse could have been trading for furs like Arctic fox and polar bear pelts, and for walrus and narwhal ivory. This suggests that the relationship was not always hostile, as it was described in Vinland. At least for a time, there was a functioning trade network. One tantalizing clue is a small, carved, wooden figure found at the Nanook site. It was made by a Dorset artist. It shows a person wearing a long, hooded robe or cassock with a cross etched on the chest. It looks for all the world like a depiction of a European, possibly a Christian cleric. It is a stunning piece of evidence, a local person's impression of one of these strange visitors from the east. The Norse presence in Helluland was likely seasonal. Small groups of men from Greenland would sail west in the summer to trade and gather resources, returning before the sea ice closed in. These were long and dangerous journeys. They built temporary camps, shelters of stone and turf to use for a few weeks or months. Over time, as the Greenland colony declined and the climate cooled, these voyages stopped. The camps were abandoned, and the connection was lost. The memory of Helluland survived only in the sagas, a forgotten chapter of the Viking exploration of North America, a story of small, tough groups of men operating for a brief time in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Number 5, their last stand was on a small Welsh island. The Vikings raided Wales for centuries, just as they did England, Scotland, and Ireland. They sacked monasteries at St. David's and Llanbadarn Fawr. They sailed up the rivers and extorted tribute from the Welsh princes, but they found it much harder to gain a permanent foothold in Wales. The country was mountainous and fragmented into small, fiercely independent kingdoms. Unlike in England, there was no large, vulnerable kingdom like Northumbria for them to conquer. They did, however, establish settlements. These were not large territories, but small coastal bases, trading posts, and pirate nests. They settled on the islands off the coast, like Anglesey, which they called Anglesey, and on the flat coastal plains of the south. The city of Swansea's name likely comes from the Old Norse Svansey, meaning Svane's Island. Cardiff and Fishguard also show Norse influence in their names. These were urban centers, places where the Norse could trade and overwinter their fleets. One of the most significant areas of Norse Gaelic settlement was on the island of Anglesey. Its strategic position controlling the sea route between Dublin and the Norse Kingdom of York made it incredibly valuable. For a time, it was a battleground between the Welsh and the Dublin Vikings. In the 10th century, the island was often under the control of Norse Gaelic lords who ruled from the sea. The story of the end of this Norse influence in North Wales centers on a dramatic battle in 1098. A powerful Norman force, led by the Earl of Chester and the Earl of Shrewsbury, had invaded North Wales. They had driven the Welsh king, Gruffudd ap Cynon, into retreat. The Normans built a castle at Aberlleiniog on Anglesey and seemed poised to conquer the region for good. Gruffudd and his ally were trapped. Then, a Viking fleet appeared off the coast. It was led by Magnus Barefoot, the King of Norway. Magnus was a throwback, an old-style Viking king who spent his reign campaigning and raiding around the British Isles to reassert Norwegian power. The Normans on Anglesey, seeing the ships, were likely pleased. They probably assumed the Vikings were allies or mercenaries for hire. They went down to the shore to greet them. They were wrong. Magnus Barefoot had his own agenda. As the Normans stood on the beach, the Norwegians opened fire with their bows. The sagas give a vivid, almost cinematic account of what happened next. Magnus himself stood at the prow of his ship with his bow. Another man stood beside him. They both shot at the Norman leader, the Earl of Shrewsbury. Both arrows struck him. One hit him in the eye. The saga says that when the Earl was hit, Magnus shouted across the water, "Let him leap." It was a brutal, mocking display of power. The Earl died instantly. The Norman invasion of Anglesey collapsed. The death of their leader broke their morale, and they withdrew. Magnus Barefoot did not stay to conquer the island. He had made his point. He had shown that the King of Norway was still a power to be reckoned with in the Irish Sea. He sailed away, leaving the Welsh to reclaim their lands. This battle was a pivotal moment. It was one of an old-style Viking king intervening in the new world of Norman feudal politics. The Battle of Anglesey Sound was the high water mark of direct Norwegian royal power in Wales after Magnus was killed on a raid in Ireland a few years later. The era of the great Viking sea kings was over. The small Norse settlements in Wales were slowly absorbed. The settlers intermarried with the Welsh, adopted their language, and became part of the local landscape. The memory of their presence faded, leaving only a handful of place names and the dramatic story of a Viking king's last great raid in Welsh waters. Number 4, they built a round fortress for a king's army. In the late 10th century, something strange happened in Denmark. A series of massive, perfectly circular fortresses were built. 4 of them have been found: Fyrkat and Agersborg in Jutland, Nonnebakken on Funen, and Trelleborg on Zealand. A 5th similar fortress has been found at Trelleborg in southern Sweden, which was then part of Denmark. These were not like the usual chaotic Viking settlements. They were marvels of engineering and brutalist military design. The Trelleborg-style fortresses were all built to the same precise geometric plan. They consisted of a huge circular earthwork rampart, sometimes with a V-shaped ditch outside. The rampart was pierced by 4 gates at the cardinal points of the compass. Inside, 2 wooden paved roads crossed at a perfect right angle in the center. In the 4 quadrants created by the roads, large, identical longhouses were arranged in a strict square pattern. The largest fortress, Agersborg, was 240 meters in diameter and could have held up to 48 longhouses. These were not towns, they were military barracks on a colossal scale. The longhouses themselves were unique. They were not the simple rectangular halls of a typical farm. They were ship-shaped, with curved walls bulging in the middle. They were sophisticated constructions requiring a huge amount of timber and skilled carpentry. A fortress like Trelleborg in Denmark would have required around 8,000 mature oak trees to build. The forests for miles around must have been clear-cut. This was not the work of a local chieftain. This was a royal project, a massive act of state power. For a long time, the purpose of these fortresses was a mystery, but tree ring dating of the timbers has provided a crucial clue. They were all built in a very narrow time frame, around the year 980. This points directly to one man, Harald Bluetooth, the king who united Denmark and converted the kingdom to Christianity. He was a powerful and ambitious ruler. So why did he build these fortresses? There are 2 main theories. The first is that they were training and assembly points for the invasion of England. In the 990s, massive, well-organized Danish armies under Sweyn Forkbeard Harald's son began to attack England, culminating in the conquest of the entire country in 1013. The Trelleborg fortresses would have been the perfect places to gather the thousands of men and hundreds of ships needed for such a campaign. A warrior would live in one of the barracks, part of a disciplined unit, waiting for the order to sail. The second theory is that they were built for internal control. Harald Bluetooth had to force his new brand of centralized Christian kingship on a country of rebellious local chieftains. These fortresses, placed at strategic points across his kingdom, would have been bases for his royal army. They were powerful symbols of his authority, a way of saying, I am in charge. They could be used to put down rebellions and enforce his rule. It is likely both theories are true. They served to consolidate his power at home and project it abroad. Life inside one of these fortresses would have been rigid and disciplined. A soldier, maybe a man named Nud, would have lived with his comrades in one of the longhouses. His days would have been filled with military drills and guard duty. The fortresses were not used for very long, perhaps only 15 to 20 years. They were built for a specific purpose, and once that purpose was served, they were abandoned. They fell into ruin and were forgotten for centuries, their perfect circular shapes slowly smoothed over by plowing. Their rediscovery in the 20th century revealed a hidden chapter of Viking history, a moment when the chaotic energy of the raiders was being forged into the disciplined power of a royal army, all within the strict geometry of a king's fortress. Number 3. The forest Finns were their northern neighbors. Bjarmland is a mysterious place mentioned in the Norse sagas. It was a territory somewhere on the shores of the White Sea in the far north of what is now Russia. For the Vikings of northern Norway, Bjarmland was a land of legend and immense wealth. It was inhabited by a people they called the Bjarmar, who were likely Finno-Ugric peoples, ancestors of the modern Karelians or other groups. The most famous account of a voyage to Bjarmland comes from the story of Othir of Halagaland. Othir was a wealthy Norse chieftain who lived in northern Norway in the late 9th century. He was a farmer and a trader. His story was written down at the court of King Alfred the Great in England. Othir described his home as the northernmost of all Norse settlements. Beyond him, the land was wilderness, inhabited only by the Sami, whom he called Finns. Othir was a practical man. He wanted to know how far the land stretched to the north, so he sailed. He sailed north along the coast of Norway, around the North Cape, and then turned east into the White Sea. He sailed for 15 days. He eventually came to a great river, and the land on both sides was inhabited. The people, the Bjarmar, were friendly, and he was able to trade with them. He said their language was similar to that of the Finns. Other was not a raider, he was a trader. He traded for the precious furs that the Bjarmar trapped in the vast northern forests, marten, beaver, and sable. The fur trade was the main reason for these long, dangerous voyages, but later voyages were not so peaceful. The sagas tell of other chieftains, like Thorihund and Karli, who made expeditions to Bjarmland in the 11th century. Their goal was plunder. The sagas describe a temple or sanctuary of the Bjarmian god Jamali. This temple was said to contain a great treasure, a burial mound filled with silver and gold. And Thorir and his men raided the sanctuary, stole the treasure, and had to fight their way back to their ships. These stories paint a picture of a remote frontier. A Norse trader or raider on the shores of Bjarmland would have been at the extreme edge of his world. The landscape was taiga and tundra. The winters were long and brutal. The people he met were culturally very different. They were shamanistic, skilled hunters and trappers who knew the forest intimately. The Norse came by sea, the Bjarmar by the rivers that flowed out of the deep interior. They met on the coast to trade or to fight. Archaeological evidence for the Norse presence in this region is scarce but intriguing. A handful of Scandinavian artifacts, including an 11th century sword hilt, have been found in the Arkhangelsk region. It is not evidence of permanent settlement, but of contact. The Norse likely established temporary trading posts, small camps they used during the summer months, or they would have lived in tents or simple huts bartering their goods before making the long journey home before the sea froze. The voyages to Bjarmland probably stopped in the 13th century. The rise of the Republic of Novgorod meant that the Russians now controlled the northern fur trade. They pushed out the Norwegians. The memory of Bjarmland faded into myth, a half-remembered story of a rich land in the far north. It was a forgotten trading frontier, a place where Norse seafarers met the people of the northern forests, a brief and often violent interaction driven by Europe's insatiable demand for luxury furs. Number 2, the first city in Sweden was a global market. On the small island of Björkö in Lake Mälaren, about 30 kilometers west of modern Stockholm, lie the remains of a town called Birka. Founded in the mid-8th century, it was one of the first true urban centers in Scandinavia. For 200 years, it was a vital hub of the Viking world, a place where trade routes from west and east converged. It was not a capital city in a political sense, but a bustling international marketplace. A visitor to Birka in the year 900 would have been amazed. Unlike the scattered farmsteads that made up most of Scandinavia, Birka was a planned town. It had a permanent population of around 700 to 1,000 people. A great earthen rampart, the Borg, stood on a high cliff, a refuge in times of danger. Below it, the town spread out along the shore. There were distinct districts for craftspeople, blacksmiths, weavers, comb makers, and jewelers. The harbor would have been packed with ships. There would be Norse longships, broad-beamed cargo ships from Frisia, and riverboats from the east. You would hear dozens of languages spoken in the streets. Birka's wealth was built on trade. It was the western terminus of the river routes that led through Russia to the Byzantine and Arab worlds. Archaeologists excavating Birka have found objects from all over the globe They have found thousands of silver dirham coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, minted in places like Baghdad and Samarkand. They have found silk from China, glassware from the Rhineland, pottery from France, and carnelian beads from India. They even found a small bronze Buddha statue brought all the way from northern India, and in a 9th century woman's grave, they found a ring with a piece of colored glass inscribed with Arabic letters that read, "For Allah." Her life in Burqa was organized around this trade. A merchant living there would spend his winters preparing for the summer trading season. He would gather local products, furs from the north, iron forged from the local bog ore, and slaves. When the ice on the lake melted, the ships would arrive and the town would come alive. The merchant would trade his goods for the silver, silk, and spices from the east, or the wine and weapons from the west. We know about Burqa not just from archaeology, but from a written account by a Christian missionary named Ansgar. He visited Burqa twice, in 829 and 852, in an attempt to convert the Swedes to Christianity. He described the town, its king, and its thing assembly. He was allowed to build a small church, but his mission was not very successful. The people of Burqa mostly held to their old gods. Graves excavated at Burqa show this. Most are pagan burials, with the dead cremated on a pyre or buried with their possessions. Some are ship burials reserved for the wealthy. One of the most famous graves at Burqa, discovered in the 1880s, was long thought to be that of a great male warrior. The grave was filled with high-status weapons, including a sword, an axe, and arrows. 2 horses were buried with the body. For over a century, this Burqa warrior was the textbook example of a Viking chieftain. But in 2017, a DNA analysis of the bones revealed a surprise. The warrior was a woman. This discovery has forced a complete re-evaluation of the role of women in Viking society. It suggests that women could hold positions of high military authority. Burqa was abandoned suddenly around the year 975. We don't know exactly why. The harbor may have silted up, or the trade routes may have shifted. A new town, Sigtuna, was founded nearby and took over its role. Burqa was left to nature. The wooden houses rotted away, and the site became a quiet field. Its rediscovery by archaeologists has brought back to life this forgotten city, a vibrant multicultural marketplace that was, for a short time, the economic heart of the Viking world. Number 1, they were so close, but they never met. The western settlement of Greenland was the northernmost outpost of European settlement in the medieval world. It was a community of farmers and hunters living on the absolute margin of survival, just a few hundred miles to the west. Across the narrow ice-choked waters of the Davis Strait lay Baffin Island, the land they called Helluland. On that island and along the coast of Labrador lived the people the Norse called Skraelings, specifically the Dorset culture, a Paleo-Eskimo people who had inhabited the Arctic for thousands of years. These two groups of people, the Norse and the Dorset, were, for a time, near neighbors. They were two of the most remarkable cultures on the planet. The Norse, with their iron tools, ocean-going ships, and domestic animals, represented the furthest reach of the European agricultural world. The Dorset, with their incredibly sophisticated technology of bone, ivory, and stone, were masters of Arctic survival, a culture perfectly adapted to one of the world's harshest climates. They lived in close proximity for perhaps 300 to 400 years. We know from the evidence on Baffin Island, the Norse yarn, the whetstones, the crucible, that the Norse visited Helluland. They almost certainly encountered the Dorset people. The small carved figure of a European found at a Dorset site is a portrait of one of these encounters. So, what was the nature of this contact? It was likely sporadic. A Norse ship from the western settlement, probably looking for wood, furs, or ivory, would have arrived in the summer. They might have set up a temporary camp on the shore. They might have met a group of Dorset hunters. Imagine that meeting. A Norseman named Einar, dressed in wool, carrying an iron axe. A Dorset hunter, dressed in caribou skin, carrying a harpoon tipped with a razor-sharp stone blade. They would not have been able to speak to each other. Their worlds were utterly different. The Norsemen believed in Christ and Valhalla. The Dorset hunters' world was populated by animal spirits and powerful shamans. What did they think of each other? The Dorset man might have been amazed by the Norseman's ship. a floating wooden island and his metal tools. The Norsemen might have been impressed by the Dorset hunter's skill and his ability to thrive in a land that seemed so barren. There was likely some trade. The Norse had metal, which was immensely valuable to the Dorset. A few pieces of iron could be fashioned into many knife blades or harpoon tips. The Dorset had furs and ivory, which the Norse coveted, but the relationship was probably also tense and mistrustful. The sagas describe the natives of Vinland as hostile, and there is no reason to think the relationship in the north was any easier. What is most remarkable is what did not happen. There was no large-scale exchange of technology or culture. The Norse did not adopt the Dorset kayak or their superior winter clothing. The Dorset did not adopt Norse animal husbandry or iron smelting. The two cultures met, touched briefly, and then moved on. They remained separate. There was no fusion, no new hybrid culture created in the high Arctic. Then both cultures vanished from the region. Around the year 1350, the Norse abandoned the western settlement in Greenland due to climate change and economic isolation. Around the same time, the Dorset culture disappeared. They were replaced by a new, more technologically advanced Arctic people, the Thule, who were the direct ancestors of the modern Inuit. The Thule expanded rapidly across the Arctic, and the Dorset, for reasons not fully understood, faded away. The narrow gap of water between Greenland and Baffin Island became empty again. The brief period when these two extraordinary cultures were neighbors came to an end. It is a story of a missed connection. The forgotten settlement of the Western Norse and the forgotten culture of the Dorset were like two ships that passed in the Arctic night. They saw each other's lights, they might have hailed each other across the water, but they never truly met. They each faced their own challenges, and in the end, the unforgiving Arctic environment claimed them both.